You don't belong here." Howard Gibbons spat the words with venom, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Eli Turner from across the street. Eli's grip tightened on the steering wheel, the weight of the words sinking deep. It had started innocently. Enough, a new neighborhood, a fresh start. But now, every step they took felt like a misstep. The first scratches on the car, the offensive graffiti on the mailbox, the cold smiles from neighbors who once seemed warm. Eli had tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a few unlucky incidents. But when the threats escalated, when his daughter, Maya, was attacked at school, and Nina received anonymous hate mail, he couldn't turn the other cheek any longer. The Gibbons family wasn't just any neighbors. They were the kind of people who hid their racism behind polite gestures, their cruelty behind friendly faces. And now Eli had to ask himself, how far was he willing to go to protect his family? Because, for the first time, it felt like it wasn't just their house on the line, it was their lives. The Turner family had worked hard for this moment. Years of late nights, high-profile cases, and sacrifice had led them to the door of this house. Eli Turner, a seasoned corporate lawyer with a sharp mind and steady hand, had finally given his family a home. A place where they could breathe freely, without the weight of the world pressing down on them. Nina, his wife, was beaming as she stepped through the front door for the first time, clutching the keys to their new life. Their daughter Maya, who had recently turned 15, danced through the house with a smile that lit up the entire room. For the first time in a long while, there was hope in their hearts. Their dream had been simple, a quiet suburban neighborhood where they could settle down, where Nina could work from home, and Maya could attend a good school. Peace, stability, and a community that could give them the kind of life they'd always dreamed of. The neighborhood was everything they'd hoped for. The lawns were perfectly manicured, each house looking like a model from a magazine. There was a tranquility that seemed to hang in the air, a hum of life that felt different from the chaos of the city they had left behind. The neighbors were friendly, always smiling, offering waves and kind words as they passed by. There was an unspoken warmth in the way people greeted each other, a collective sense of pride in how the neighborhood had been built. Eli stood on the porch that first evening, looking out across the street, a cool breeze tugging at the collar of his shirt. The sky was painted with the colors of sunset, and for a moment, everything seemed perfect. There was a feeling of contentment in the air, a sense that, for once, they had found the calm after the storm. Across the street, Howard Gibbons sat on his porch, a beer bottle in hand. He raised it in a lazy toast as Eli caught his gaze. Eli nodded, returning the gesture with a polite smile, though there was something about the man's eyes cold, assessing they didn't sit right. Still, Eli dismissed it. After all, a neighborhood was nothing without its quirks. Howard's wave, though stiff, was an invitation to begin building relationships. The Turners were newcomers, and they knew the drill: small talk, pleasantries, and a slow easing into the rhythm of suburban life. But there was something about Howard that lingered in Eli's mind, something off, something almost predatory. He could feel it in the way Howard's gaze stayed locked on him, just a fraction too long. Nina, standing beside Eli, squeezed his hand. "I think we've finally found it," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "A place where we can really start over." Eli nodded, though a small, inexplicable unease gnawed at him. He had worked his entire life to provide for his family, to give them the kind of security that most could only dream of. But this new life was about more than just material success. It was about freedom. Freedom from the kind of fear and prejudice they had faced before. As the sun dipped lower, the streets became quieter, and the Turner family retreated into their home. But even as they settled in, the sense of peace seemed fragile. Beneath the idyllic surface, there was a tension that none of them could yet name. It wasn't just the occasional glance from the neighbors, or the odd comment that seemed to carry more weight than it should. It was something deeper, something hidden behind the walls of smiles and good intentions. And as the days passed, Eli's unease would grow into something far darker, something that no amount of politeness or charm could hide. The Turners had arrived in a perfect neighborhood. Or so it seemed. The first sign came 2 weeks after the Turner family had settled in. Eli had parked the car in the driveway, just as he had every evening since they moved in. The house was quiet, The sun setting on the neatly trimmed lawns, and the hum of neighborhood life filled the air. But as he approached the car the next morning, something was off. A long, deep scratch marred the side of the car, stretching from the front door all the way to the back. It was as if someone had dragged a sharp object across it, leaving a permanent mark that could not be erased. His first thought was that it was an accident. Maybe a kid had accidentally backed into the car with a bike or something. But as he got closer, his stomach tightened. The scratch wasn't just random. It looked deliberate. A message, maybe. His knuckles tightened around the keys as he surveyed the damage. Nina came outside with a cup of coffee in her hand, frowning at the sight of the scratch. Eli, it's just a scratch. It could have happened anywhere. Eli didn't respond immediately. He bent down to inspect it closer, feeling a strange, unsettling sensation crawl over his skin. Yeah, he muttered, maybe. But something doesn't feel right. That afternoon, the mailbox was the next target. When Eli opened it, a sharp breath caught in his throat. A thick black marker had scrawled a series of slurs across the metal, an obscene, unmistakable message aimed at his family. The words were harsh, ugly, and left no room for interpretation. Eli felt his chest tighten. It was as though someone had slapped him across the face. He stepped back, feeling the heat of his anger rise. His first instinct was to go across the street and confront the Gibbons family. But he held himself back, reminded himself that reacting impulsively wasn't going to fix anything. No, he would handle this the way he knew best, methodically, rationally. He would report it to the police. He would file a complaint. They'd fix this, just like all the other problems he'd dealt with in the past. But inside, something felt different this time. This wasn't just vandalism. This was personal. He threw a glance over at the Gibbons house across the street. Howard Gibbons was out on his porch, sipping a beer, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. He wasn't looking at Eli, but Eli could feel his gaze, sharp and calculating. There was something about Howard's casual demeanor that set Eli's nerves on edge. It was like the man was too comfortable, too confident. Nina, ever the optimist, tried to downplay it. She assured him it was just a series of unfortunate incidents. That kids could be reckless, that it was nothing to make a fuss over. She suggested they let it go and keep moving forward, that dwelling on it would only give the harassers what they wanted: attention. But as the days went on, the strange events kept piling up. The garbage was spilled across their driveway on 2 separate mornings. Nothing else was disturbed. No valuables missing, just the trash, scattered and torn open. At first, Eli thought it could be some random act of mischief, but by the 3rd time it happened, his stomach churned with unease. It wasn't just carelessness anymore. This was intentional. The neighbors, for the most part, acted as though nothing was wrong. They waved politely when they saw Eli and his family, offering thin, awkward smiles. The Gibbons, particularly, seemed overly polite, almost too perfect in their social graces. Howard would wave from across the street, always with a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. His wife, Carol, was no different, greeting them with a soft, forced smile that quickly faded when the conversation ended. The Gibbons children, however, were a different story. There was a coldness to their behavior that Eli could not ignore. They never made eye contact when they spoke to him or Nina, and their exchanges with Maya were even worse. The kids, particularly the Gibbons' eldest son, Daniel, would mutter things under their breath when they passed, and Maya would look away, unsure how to respond. There was an icy edge to the way the neighborhood's children interacted with her, a marked difference from the usual suburban friendliness that one would expect in such a quiet place. One afternoon, as Maya came home from school, Eli caught her standing at the window, staring out at the street. When he approached her, he saw the distant look in her eyes. It wasn't the carefree innocence he'd come to expect from her. "What's wrong, honey?" Eli asked gently. Maya shook her head. "It's nothing. Just ... just a couple of things." She hesitated before adding, "They called me names at school today." Eli's chest tightened. "Who?" "The Gibbons kids," she whispered. "They said things, stuff about me and Mom. She stopped herself, clearly not wanting to say more. "Do you want me to go talk to the principal?" Maya looked at him, her expression softening. "No, Dad, it's fine. They're just ... mean." Eli's hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. He had been on the receiving end of harsh words and judgment before, but this was different. This wasn't some random stranger or distant acquaintance. These were the neighbors they had trusted, the people who were supposed to be their new friends. And they had turned on them, slowly, methodically, like a disease spreading through the quiet, pristine streets. Days later, the situation escalated. Eli and Nina were both out at work when the anonymous threats started arriving in their mailbox. Threats that were clear and unambiguous. A letter stuffed with hate-filled words. Another one taunting them for their presence in a neighborhood that didn't want them. It was a cruel irony. Eli had spent his entire life fighting for justice, for equality, and here, in this supposed safe haven, he was being punished simply for existing. But it wasn't until the house was egged one evening that the full weight of what was happening set in. Nina had just come in from the grocery store. Bags in hand, when she gasped, staring in horror at the sight of yellow, sticky egg yolk running down the front door. The message was clear, and this time there was no mistaking it. This was no random vandalism. This was a hate crime. Eli's eyes narrowed as he looked at the mess, his mind already working, calculating the next steps. He knew how to fight back in the courtroom, but here, in his own home, the law seemed powerless. There was no one to call for this. No system that would step in and fix it. No police officer who could erase the feeling of being unwanted, of being attacked without reason. The Gibbons were still polite, still playing the role of the perfect neighbors, but every interaction felt forced, every conversation ending too abruptly. When Eli tried to engage with Howard one afternoon, asking about the neighborhood and what was happening, Howard smiled but kept his answers short. It was as if there were invisible walls between them, walls that no one dared break. The rising tension was palpable. Each new incident, each new threat, was like a tiny, sharp needle being pushed deeper into Eli's side. He had always believed that law and justice could right any wrong, but now he felt like he was fighting a silent war, one where the enemy hid behind the polite faces of his neighbors, masked by smiles and waves. They were the ones who made his family feel unwelcome, the ones who had quietly declared that they didn't belong. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. Eli felt a quiet rage building inside him, not just for what was happening to him and his family, but for the fact that there was no outlet, no resolution. He could call the police, but he knew the result. He could report the incidents, but he knew nothing would change. He had been trained to fight in the courtroom, to battle for justice, but now he had to wonder who would fight for him. His family was on edge, their nerves fraying with each passing day. Maya, usually so bright, was now withdrawn, her smile a rare thing. Nina, despite her optimism, was beginning to crack under the pressure. And Eli, for all his legal expertise, felt utterly powerless. What started as a dream of peace in the suburbs had turned into a nightmare of quiet hostility and covert attacks. The Turners had come looking for a place to start fresh, but instead, they had found something far darker, something they couldn't escape. And the Gibbons family? They weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. The weight of the events was starting to feel unbearable. What had once been a series of isolated incidents had slowly built into something far more sinister, more deliberate. Eli had been patient, had given the benefit of the doubt, thinking that maybe it was just a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. But by the time the third letter arrived in the mailbox, with its taunting, ugly words, something inside him snapped. He had always believed in the power of the law. It was his profession, his lifeblood. But no matter how many times he called the police or filed complaints, it felt like the system wasn't on his side. Each time, the responses were the same. There's not enough evidence, or it could have been anyone. Each word chipped away at Eli's confidence in the system he had dedicated his life to. He had been a lawyer for over 15 years. He knew how to navigate the legal landscape. But in this quiet suburban town, he was powerless. He had tried to approach the Gibbons family multiple times, trying to address the situation with reason, to break the ice, to talk like neighbors. The first time he spoke with Howard, the man gave him that same tight-lipped smile, all politeness, but with an underlying bitterness that Eli couldn't ignore. When Eli asked if there was anything troubling him about the Turners' presence in the neighborhood, Howard had simply shrugged. "Nothing personal, just how it is around here," was all he said. After that, any attempt to engage the Gibbons family was met with either apathy or outright hostility. Howard would wave, but never acknowledge Eli's attempts at conversation. Carol, his wife, was polite but cold, her eyes always darting away whenever Eli made an effort to speak. The Gibbons children never spoke to Maya directly, but their cruel gestures mimicked slurs, or the pointed laughter when they passed by. Volumes. The Turners had become something else to the neighbors, a problem to be ignored at best, targeted at worst. And no matter what Eli did, no matter how hard he tried to appeal to reason, the harassment only grew. The scratch on his car, the graffiti on the mailbox, the trash strewn across their lawn. Each act felt like a message, but Eli couldn't decipher it. Was it just ignorance, or was it something darker? Something more calculated? And then, one evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Eli and Nina came home to find the front door slightly ajar. The lock wasn't broken, but it didn't feel right. His heart pounded as he pushed the door open. The house was eerily silent, nothing amiss at first glance. But as they stepped inside, a sharp gasp from Nina sent Eli's heart racing. A crude message had been scrawled across the living room wall, large and jagged. "Go back to where you came from." The words were covered in spray paint, ugly and aggressive. And beneath them were more slurs, racial epithets that burned their way into Eli's mind. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't random. This wasn't some isolated act of teenage rebellion. This was a campaign of terror designed to drive his family out of the neighborhood. Eli stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on the words. His mind raced, but nothing came to him. There was no immediate solution, no legal recourse that could fix this. They had crossed a line. This was no longer about minor inconvenience. This was about hate, and it had been carefully and systematically aimed at his family. Nia collapsed onto the couch, her hands trembling as she tried to process the horror of what they had just walked into. Eli... What are we going to do? How can we stay here? Eli clenched his fists, a surge of frustration rising in his chest. He was a lawyer. He knew the law. He had fought for justice for others for years. But here, in his own home, in the place where he was supposed to feel safe, he was being attacked. And his law was doing nothing. Nina's voice trembled again, her eyes wide with fear. "Eli, I don't think I can stay here anymore. I'm scared. I don't feel safe... I don't feel like we belong here. Maya... She's scared too." Eli's heart ached as he thought of Maya. His strong, resilient daughter was crumbling under the weight of what was happening. Her confidence had begun to slip away, her spirit darkening as she faced daily harassment from the other children, most of whom were either directly or indirectly tied to the Gibbons family. He knew she wasn't the type to show her fear, but he could see the change in her. The way she looked at the world now, like it was a place that didn't welcome her. A place that didn't see her. The next few days felt like a blur. Eli filed another police report, but he knew it would be no different from the others. The officers took their time, filled out their forms, and promised to look into it. But Eli knew he had seen it before. The apathy in their eyes, the way they dismissed complaints from people like him. Black families in white neighborhoods weren't seen as real victims. The system, as much as he fought for it, seemed to turn its back when it came to people like him. Eli tried to keep his calm. He tried to be the lawyer, to fight this with the logic and precision he was known for. But each failed attempt, each dismissive response, wore him down. He had nothing left to turn to. The law didn't help, the neighborhood didn't care, and his family was unraveling. They were being forced into a corner, and every corner seemed darker than the last. One night, after the incident in the living room, Eli went to his office. He had a case he was supposed to focus on, some corporate dispute he had been pushing to get resolved, but his mind couldn't focus. He couldn't ignore the knot in his stomach, the overwhelming sense of powerlessness that had settled in his chest. He sat at his desk, papers scattered around him, but his eyes were blank, his thoughts consumed with one question: how much longer could they stay here? His phone buzzed, interrupting the silence. It was a message from Nina. "Maya's at the door. She won't come inside. She's been crying for hours." Eli didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, his keys, and rushed home. When he arrived, Maya was standing on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes red from crying. The second he saw her, a wave of guilt crashed over him. He had failed her. He had promised her a fresh start, a place to be happy. And now, every day, she faced the weight of what this neighborhood had become. "Maya," Eli said, his voice cracking. "Come inside, baby. Please, we'll figure this out, okay?" She shook her head, tears falling. I just want it to stop. I don't want to go back to school. I don't want to go out there anymore. Everyone knows who I am. They look at me like I don't belong. I don't belong, Dad. I don't belong anywhere." Eli's heart shattered at her words. This wasn't the life he had promised her. This wasn't the world he had fought to give her. They weren't just being harassed anymore, they were being hunted. And no matter how hard he fought, it felt like he was losing. That night, as they sat in their living room, the family was quieter than usual. The weight of the events, the messages, the fear, it all pressed in around them, thick and suffocating. Nina sat close to Maya, her hand on her daughter's back, trying to comfort her. Eli stared out the window, seeing nothing but the shadows that stretched across the lawn. They were trapped. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, Eli didn't know how to fight back. All his training, all his experience, couldn't save them from this. He had built his career on his ability to solve problems, to bring justice. But now, with his family's safety on the line, he felt more powerless than he ever had in the courtroom. This was the moment. The final straw. No longer could Eli stand by and let the law fail him. No longer could he ignore the simmering rage that had built in his chest. Something had to change. It wouldn't be with the law. It wouldn't be with the police or the system that had let them down time and time again. Eli wasn't just going to be a victim anymore. It was time to take matters into his own hands. Eli sat at his desk long after midnight, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across his office. The weight of the past few months was heavy in his chest, a constant reminder of the things he had been unable to fix. He glanced at the case files spread across his desk, the legal briefs and papers that were supposed to bring in the next paycheck. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, his focus was elsewhere. He hadn't expected things to go this far. He had thought that by handling things through the system, through the law, the harassment would stop. But each failed attempt, each dismissive police officer, each insincere neighbor only confirmed what he had suspected. The system wasn't going to help him. No, this time, it would be different. He wasn't going to wait for the law to act. This time, he would be the one in control. Using his skills as a lawyer, Eli had already begun to gather information. Quietly, methodically, he dug into the history of Howard Gibbons and his family, using every connection he had in the legal world. Howard Gibbons, on the surface, was the picture of suburban success. He owned a number of properties, ran a small but profitable construction business, and seemed to be well respected in the community. But as Eli peeled back the layers, he discovered something darker beneath the surface. There were whispers about Howard's business dealings, deals that didn't seem entirely above board. Eli found court records detailing lawsuits filed against Howard's company over shady contracts, allegations of workers being underpaid, and even claims that the construction work had been substandard, leading to unsafe buildings. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern. Howard had a reputation for exploiting his workers, using his wealth and influence to avoid facing the consequences. But it wasn't just his business dealings that caught Eli's attention. There were rumors, vague but persistent, that Howard had used his influence to keep local officials on his side, to avoid scrutiny when things went wrong. Eli knew that if he could expose this, it might be the key to breaking the Gibbons family's hold over the neighborhood. The thought of using Howard's own tactics against him gave Eli a sense of grim satisfaction. But it wasn't just Howard's shady business practices that concerned him. There was the harassment of Maya, the slurs written on his car, the graffiti on his mailbox. The Gibbons family was targeting his family, and Eli was no longer willing to just endure it. He began to dig into the Gibbons children's backgrounds, using his access to school records and connections in the district. What he found only confirmed what he already suspected. The Gibbons kids were known troublemakers. They had a history of bullying, of targeting children who were different, and Eli knew it wasn't just a coincidence that Maya had become their latest target. With every detail Eli uncovered, the anger inside him grew. But so did his resolve. He was no longer the passive victim. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. This was personal. This was about protecting his family, about showing that the Turners wouldn't be run out of town by a family that used their money and influence to hide their true nature. Eli's first step was to expose Howard's business dealings. He composed an anonymous letter, detailing everything he had found, the lawsuits, the substandard work, the shady deals. He sent it to local authorities, to the business regulators, and even to a local newspaper. It wasn't a direct attack, it was a quiet whisper that would spread and gain attention. Howard's reputation would begin to unravel without a single word of confrontation. Eli could already imagine Howard's face when the investigation started. He would be blindsided, caught off guard. It would be the first move in a game he didn't know he was playing. But Eli didn't stop there. He continued to gather evidence, compiling files on the Gibbons family's behavior, from the harassment at school to the incidents that had occurred on the Turners' property. He quietly spoke to neighbors who had witnessed the Gibbons children's cruel behavior, making sure to keep everything off the record for now. Eli knew he couldn't rely on the police, but he could rely on his own expertise. He began putting together a case, one that would slowly, quietly, turn the tables. As the days passed, Eli's sense of purpose sharpened. He spent his evenings quietly working, analyzing the evidence he had collected, preparing his strategy. He had become something else, not just a lawyer, but a strategist. He understood how to play the game, how to use the law, not just as a weapon, but as a shield. He had always known that in the courtroom, victory didn't always come from being right. It came from being prepared, from understanding the rules, and using them to your advantage. This was no different. And as Eli sat at his desk, the quiet determination settled over him like a cloak. He was ready. Ready to face Howard, ready to face the Gibbons family, ready to use everything he had learned to break their hold over his family and expose them for what they truly were. The law would be his weapon, but it would be more personal than any case he had fought before. Late one evening, as Eli sat in his office, preparing the final pieces of his plan, Nina entered the room. She had been quieter lately, her eyes filled with worry, the stress of the ongoing harassment weighing on her as much as it weighed on Eli. "What are you thinking, Eli?" Nina asked, her voice soft but steady. Eli looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and exhaustion. "I'm thinking it's time to stop waiting for someone else to fix this. I'm thinking it's time to make them pay for what they've done. I'm going to make sure Howard and his family can't hurt us anymore." Nina nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving him. "Are you sure about this? I know you're angry, but what if this makes everything worse?" Eli reached across the desk and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I don't have a choice, Nina. We can't live like this anymore, and I won't let them push us out. I've spent my whole career fighting for justice. This is no different." There was a quiet silence between them, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Nina didn't speak, but Eli could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that came with knowing the family was on the brink of something dangerous. He understood that fear. It was the same fear he had carried for months, but now there was no room for fear. Only resolve. As the plan took shape, Eli felt the pieces falling into place. The Gibbons family had spent months tormenting them, using their influence, their privilege, their power to make life unbearable. But Eli wasn't going to wait any longer. He was going to use the very system they had corrupted against them. This time, it wasn't just about the law, it was about survival. Eli had always believed in justice, but now he understood something deeper. Justice didn't always come from the courts. Sometimes it came from the quiet, calculated steps of those who refused to back down. The game had begun. The Gibbons family had no idea what was coming for them. The first tremors of the Gibbons family's downfall began when the anonymous letter Eli had sent months ago finally bore fruit. It wasn't long before local authorities launched a formal investigation into Howard's business dealings. The carefully documented list of fraudulent contracts, safety violations, and the alleged exploitation of workers began circulating, reaching the right ears news outlets, the local business council, and even the city's planning department. It wasn't an explosion, but a quiet rumble. Behind the scenes, the pressure-mounted Eli had spent weeks preparing the case, compiling evidence of the Gibbons family's misdeeds. Every meeting with the authorities, every phone call, every piece of information had been meticulously planned. He knew exactly how far he could push the boundaries without revealing himself, how to manipulate the system to his advantage. As Howard's business empire slowly crumbled under the weight of the investigation, Eli could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere around him. The once confident Gibbons family, whose influence had seemed so unshakable, was now on the defensive. Their businesses began to face scrutiny. Local customers, once loyal to Howard's construction company, began to question the integrity of the work, while suppliers started pulling contracts in light of the allegations. Eli watched it all unfold with a quiet satisfaction. The power balance was shifting, and for the first time, it felt like the Turners were the ones in control. But the Gibbons family didn't go down without a fight. As their world began to collapse, the Gibbons resorted to desperate measures. They lashed out more openly, trying to intimidate Eli and his family, perhaps hoping to break their spirits or force them into submission. Howard, who had once greeted Eli with false politeness, now openly avoided him, but not without a glance of icy disdain. Eli felt the weight of the tension every time he encountered Howard or one of the Gibbons children. The encounters were tense, filled with unspoken threats and simmering hatred. And as the days wore on, Howard's passive-aggressive demeanor shifted into outright hostility. It became clear that the Gibbons family had reached their breaking point, and their desperation was palpable. One evening, after the culmination of months of pressure, Eli found himself face-to-face with Howard once again. The two stood in the front yard, their confrontation inevitable. Howard had come across the street to deliver a message, his eyes narrowed in quiet fury. Eli knew that the time for subtlety was over. It was a final reckoning. "Eli," Howard began, his voice low, but laced with venom. "You've crossed a line. You've been digging into things that aren't your business. I'm not going to sit back and let you destroy my family." Eli met Howard's glare head-on. He had seen men like Howard before, the ones who believed their wealth and influence gave them power over others. But Eli had learned long ago that there was always a way to take back control. "I'm not the one destroying your family, Howard," Eli replied, his tone calm but firm. "You've done that all on your own, and I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." Howard stepped closer, his fists clenched, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. "You'll regret this. I will make sure of it. Don't think I won't retaliate. I can ruin you. And your family will be next." The tension between them was electric, thick with years of built-up animosity. Eli didn't flinch. He stood his ground, unwavering. "I've already won, Howard. You just haven't realized it yet." Howard opened his mouth to respond, but something in his chest seized up, and he stumbled back, gasping for breath. His face twisted in agony as he collapsed against the porch railing. Eli took a step forward, his eyes wide in disbelief. Howard didn't even make it to the hospital. His body was found in his office the next morning, slumped over his desk, his face frozen in a grimace of pain. The cause of death was quickly determined to be a heart attack. The suddenness of it shocked the neighborhood. Howard Gibbons, once the pillar of the community, was gone. Just like that, the news spread like wildfire. A man of Howard's stature, suddenly gone, was too much to ignore. For a brief moment, Eli questioned the role his actions had played in Howard's death. Was it his relentless pursuit, the stress of the investigation, the mounting pressure? He quickly shut down the thought. It didn't matter. Howard had brought this on himself. As the weeks passed, the Gibbons family's situation only worsened. The tragedy of Howard's death seemed to be the first domino in a much larger collapse. The rest of the family began to deteriorate, both physically and emotionally. Carol, Howard's wife, who had always appeared so composed, fell ill with what doctors later described as an autoimmune disorder. The once robust woman was now bedridden, her health declining rapidly. The family business continued to falter under the scrutiny. And soon, financial ruin loomed. But the real turning point came when their son, Daniel Gibbons, was involved in a car accident. He survived, but the accident left him with a severe concussion, followed by a series of inexplicable medical issues. One by one, the Gibbons family's health began to unravel. What had seemed like an untouchable family, a symbol of power and privilege, now a shadow of its former self. Eli didn't revel in the misfortune of the Gibbons family. He didn't take joy in their suffering. But there was a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that the tables had turned. They had harassed his family for months, pushing them to the brink of despair, forcing them to fight in ways they had never anticipated. And now, it was their turn to face the consequences. The tension that had been building for months finally began to dissolve, but there was an eerie sense of finality hanging in the air. Eli watched from his front porch as the Gibbons family's house grew quieter. No more loud parties, no more interactions with the neighbors. The shutters remained closed, and the yard grew overgrown, as if nature itself was reclaiming the land. Eli's family, however, was still intact. Maya, though still affected by the trauma, had begun to find her voice again. She smiled more often, her eyes brighter with a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. Nina, too, had started to heal. The constant fear that had gripped her for so long had loosened, though the scars remained. And Eli? He sat on his porch, staring across the street, watching as the remnants of the Gibbons empire crumbled. His thoughts were quiet, calculated. He knew he had done what was necessary. He had fought for his family, for their safety, for their right to exist in peace. The law, the system, had failed him. But Eli had found a way to win, not through the courts, not through police protection, but through his own quiet strategy, his own determination. It hadn't been easy. It had been a long and painful road. But in the end, the Gibbons family had paid the price for their actions. The street, once filled with tension and hostility, was now eerily calm. Eli had turned the tables, but he knew the price of revenge. It never felt as sweet as it seemed. As the days passed, the neighborhood settled into a strange, uneasy peace. The Turners had survived. The Gibbons family had not. But in Eli's heart, there was no victory, only relief. A deep, quiet relief that the nightmare was finally over. The Gibbons family's house stood abandoned, the once pristine yard now overgrown with weeds. The shutters were closed, the windows dark. Eli had expected this, an empty shell of what had once been a place of power, where the Gibbons had ruled the neighborhood with their quiet, oppressive dominance. Now, with Howard gone and the family scattered, the house was nothing more than a tombstone for their pride and cruelty. The neighborhood was different too. The subtle shift had begun the moment the Gibbons family's reputation began to unravel. Once, the Turners had been the outsiders, the targets of whispered gossip and veiled hostility. Now there was a strange, uneasy quiet that filled the streets. Some neighbors offered half-hearted apologies for their previous coldness, their polite gestures now tinged with regret. They stopped to chat with Eli on the sidewalk, offering shallow comments about the weather or how they had misjudged him and his family. But not all of them. Some kept their distance, wary of what the Turners represented now, the family who had stood their ground, who had fought back when they had no reason to expect they would win. They saw Eli, Nina, and Maya differently now, their eyes lingering just a little too long, as if they were unsure whether they should offer their sympathy or their fear. Eli saw it all, the pity, the avoidance, the strange, uncomfortable tension. It wasn't just the Gibbons who had left a mark on the neighborhood. It was the residue of the years of silent hate, the subtle bigotry that had seeped into the cracks of their suburban life. The Turners had become part of that landscape, now no longer the newcomers, but the family that had survived. And yet, for all their survival, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever truly be the same. As the days turned into weeks, Eli and Nina worked to rebuild their lives. Their home was safe again, at least physically, but the emotional scars remained. Maya had stopped withdrawing as much, but there was still a certain distance in her eyes, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. It was as though the world she had once seen as a place of opportunity had now become one full of suspicion and fear. Eli watched her, his heart heavy with a quiet regret. He had fought to protect her, to protect Nina, and in doing so, had taken the fight to a place where the line between justice and vengeance blurred. The system had failed them, but in the end, Eli had used that very system and his own legal knowledge to turn the tables. He had made the Gibbons family pay for what they'd done to his family, but at what cost? He thought back to the late nights spent gathering evidence, the quiet moments when the guilt had gnawed at him. He had always believed in justice, in the power of the law to right wrongs. But now, as he sat in the quiet of his home, watching his family attempt to return to normal, he wasn't so sure. The weight of the past few months, the years of harassment, the final confrontation with Howard, it all felt like a dark, unspoken truth that clung to the air. Yes, his family was safe, but it had come at a price that had transformed them all in ways they couldn't yet understand. One evening, as the sun began to set, Eli sat on the porch, his eyes fixed on the quiet street in front of him. The air was cool, and the rhythmic hum of cicadas filled the silence around him. Nina joined him, sitting beside him on the steps. They didn't speak at first, each lost in their own thoughts. The house was quite peaceful even. But the peace felt fragile, like a delicate glass waiting to shatter. Nina reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Do you think things will ever go back to normal?" she asked, her voice soft, but filled with a sadness that Eli knew all too well. "I don't know," he replied, his gaze still fixed on the empty house across the street. "I don't think they ever will," Nina sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I wish I could just forget it all, the fear, the tension. But it's like it's always there, just beneath the surface." Eli nodded, his heart aching. He felt the same way. The anger, the frustration, the constant threat, it had changed them. Even now, as they sat in the relative safety of their home, it was hard to shake the feeling that something had been lost forever. They had won, yes, but the victory didn't taste like triumph. It tasted like survival, bitter and hollow. Maya came out onto the porch, a small smile on her face as she sat next to her parents. She had been in the garden, tending to the flowers they had planted together in the spring. Eli watched her for a moment, his heart swelling with love and guilt. She was growing up so fast, her face a mixture of the child she had been and the young woman she was becoming. "I'm going to take a walk," Maya said, her voice light but carrying a heaviness that only Eli could hear. "Just around the block." Eli looked at her, his concern rising. "Are you sure? It's getting late." "I'll be fine, Dad," she replied with a smile, though there was a faint tremor in her voice. "I just need some space." Eli hesitated, but said nothing. He had done everything to protect her, and yet she was still searching for something he couldn't give her. Maybe it was closure, maybe it was peace. But Eli knew that whatever it wasn't something he could fix. It was something she would have to find on her own. Not as Maya disappeared down the street, Eli and Nina sat in the silence, the weight of the past months settling around them. Their home was safe again, but the scars, emotional and physical, would never truly heal. They had fought for their family's survival, but in doing so, they had lost something precious, the illusion of innocence. The world they had known had been forever changed, and no amount of legal victories or personal triumphs could undo that. Nina leaned her head on Eli's shoulder, her hand still clasped in his. "We survived," she said quietly. "Yeah," Eli replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We did." But even as he said the words, there was no real relief in them. Only a recognition that they had made it through, but at what cost? The neighborhood was quiet now, the Gibbons family's absence a constant reminder of the past. The Turners had survived, but the future was uncertain. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that things would never truly be the same, that the damage had been done, not just to the Gibbons family, but to his own. And as he sat on the porch, watching Maya walk down the street, he knew that the road ahead would be a long one. A road filled with the quiet echoes of everything they had lost, and everything they had fought to protect. The victory was hollow. The cost had been too high. But Eli and his family had survived. And in the end, maybe that was all that mattered.